del Instituto para la Ciudad en Movimiento. Antes va a hacer una breve introducción Andrés Portagaray, director de la cátedra Instituto para la Ciudad en Movimiento, y también Paula Vició va a participar también, está por acá. Bueno, y les comento que también están presentes los integrantes de la cátedra, Apel Muller, Carlos Schopp, Rosana Forray, Isabel Orteaga, Juan Carlos Dextre, Horacio Aiello, Angélica Albín, Fabiana Izaga, Bernardo Navarro, Andrea Gutiérrez, Alfredo Garay y Roberto Agosta. Así que bueno, los dejo con ellos.
Bueno, buenas noches a todos. Ya fue presentado el arquitecto y el doctor Smets. Solamente quería poner unas palabras de marco de en qué contexto se reúne en el Festival de Diseño la Cátedra Latinoamericana del Instituto. Es un instituto que hace investigaciones y aplicadas a la acción en temas de movilidad urbana. Tiene la sede principal en París, tiene una sede en Shanghái para China y tiene una sede en para América Latina en Buenos Aires. Algunos de los proyectos en los que ha venido trabajando tienen que ver con el diseño de las calles, que ha sido objeto de una exposición internacional y de investigaciones que siguen en curso, inclusive un libro que se llama Ganar la calle, y otro proyecto del que estuvimos hablando mucho hoy, que se llama La ciudad legible, y que tiene que ver con cómo el diseño interviene en dar códigos para la accesibilidad de las personas cuando se desplazan en la ciudad. Quería agradecer al Festival Internacional del Diseño, porque este es el segundo año consecutivo que el Instituto se asocia en las actividades con este evento. El año pasado inclusive se hizo una experiencia piloto con la línea 12 que llegó hasta acá a la puerta, que tenía que ver con la información para viajar, y este año además se ha sumado un trabajo conjunto con la Secretaría de Transportes del Gobierno de la ciudad en hacer estas investigaciones sobre el diseño aplicado a la movilidad en puntos complejos. Está aquí presente Paula Vició. Quería agradecer especialmente por la colaboración que se viene llevando en marcha con el Metrobús y ahora con los centros de intercambio, e invitarla a Paula a hacer un comentario cortito también sobre el tema.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Simplemente quería sobre todo felicitarlos y agradecer por la organización, al FID y a la Ciudad en Movimiento por el workshop que se llevó a cabo. Muy interesante. Muchas de las personas que trabajan en el equipo de la Subsecretaría de Transporte en desarrollo de Ciudad Legible participaron en el workshop y seguramente aprendieron mucho con todos los casos y experiencias internacionales que se mencionaron. Así que bueno, felicitarlos sobre todo y decirles que estamos trabajando desde el gobierno de la ciudad para tener una ciudad más legible, con poco, como les habló, más predecible, más accesible, más transparente, más abierta, y desarrollando, como dijo Andrés, un sistema de señalética para peatones, para pasajeros en centros de transbordo, que bueno, en breve lo vamos a estar implementando y seguramente después les contemos un poquito el caso y la experiencia de lo que estamos haciendo. Bueno, los dejo entonces para la conferencia. Gracias.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this introduction. I am extremely sorry not to be able to speak to you in Spanish, but I'm told that my English is so poor that you will certainly understand, even if you don't speak the language so well. Also, I will try to explain it with my hands, with my passion, so maybe that will help too. And if not, there is some kind of resume which Andres is going to be so kind to do. I would like to talk a little while with you, trying to make a point which I think may help us go forward in the discussion which we will have with the group of IVM these couple of days about the legible city. The idea being that perhaps we are not reinventing everything, and that we should look more carefully about what has been done in order to see why, what we can use, where we can find a certain inspiration. Now, the point is, however, that I also think it's important to go to talk about cartography, because we have been constantly confronted with the idea that if you want to make the city legible, you have to find means of drawing some kind of, let's call it a map or a plan, which renders evidence of what this city is about. Now, of course, yes, please. Of course, this is not the first time that this happens in the history. And I would maybe first want to start with a few overviews of, in my opinion, 3 different kinds of ways of dealing with the problem of representation. The one, and I would like to start with these images of Jerusalem, medieval images. And when you confront them with the paintings of Jerusalem, of course, drawn by painters who had never even been there, you know, they try to represent elements that have been told to them and try to put them into a certain drawing. This is what I call the first attitude, the symbolic representation. Yes, next one. When we look at the map of Rome in the Middle Ages and at the drawings, what we basically see is that actually these representations can only be understood by those who know the secret, who understand the symbols, who actually know that which church is being represented and what bridge is crossing the river. But actually, for those who know, it is a very clear drawing. So, maybe, next one please, we should not completely disregard this attitude today. Certainly, if we see that after the invention of perspective in the Renaissance, when the first maps are being drawn, in this case, the one of Amsterdam, for instance, that we clearly see that some kind of drawing buildings are being drawn more particularly because they help to understand the map. It is the map, maybe not read, but people know the building, see representation of the building, and therefore understand the map. Yes, next. And what about this? Sometimes, this is the third way of representation, we see actually that the map represents a city which in itself is symbolic. It is Babylon, in this case, or Cusco. Cusco drawn by 2 German geographers that never left Germany. So actually it doesn't have anything to do, of course, with the actual city, but it contains all the elements that the supposedly, you know, the Aztec temples and the walls and the street grid, everything that has been told about this city. And so people start thinking that Cusco looks like the plan. Second attitude is what I would call wayfinding. The map is used in order to be able to find out which is your position in the territory. And of course, let's say that the American grid, in this case Manhattan or St. Louis, is the particular device that was invented for that. The only natural elements are still the rivers, in this case the Hudson River or the Missouri River, and they are interruptions into something that is a very strict logic. And the logic, next one please, the logic is, in my opinion, particularly the logic about where am I in the system. If you can count, you can find your way. This is the case with the Cerda grid in Barcelona. This is the case with the leapfrogging developments in Arizona in the desert today. It is also the case when you arrive in New York, you take a taxi and you have, of course, I don't know, an Armenian or an Iranian taxi driver who is only living in the United States for 2 years, and he drives you anywhere you want, because if you say 4th Avenue, he asks you which street, and then he knows immediately the coordinates and he knows where to drive. So this is the map, in the opinion of wayfinding. Yes. Next one. The last and important third attitude, in my opinion, is the map as a sort of an initiation towards a global structure. Rome is, of course, the representative of that. Rome made under the popes Alexander VII, 65th, and so forth. And the scheme we see on the right is exactly representing what Rome is to be. It is just a junction of the new basilica, the new monuments that Rome is going to contain. And of course, the Noli plan, very well known, is the representation of this new global structure. So the city gets a structure through the plan. Yes? Next. And of course, well, St. Peter's is one of the representation. The point is, how do we make focus points in this new structure of the Baroque Rome? Yes, next. And this, of course, throughout until today, is one of the main attitudes. It was Wren's plan in London after the fire in 1666 is exactly based on that. It is a sort of a comprehensive structure of city blocks, but they are mutually connected by a number of important streets, and these streets are linking the Bank of England, St. Paul's Cathedral, and other focus points that are brought together. And the city gets to have a structure as a whole, starts to be understandable, even if, you know, each of the parts in themselves are different. Yes. And this is, of course, the system that was used by Haussmann in Paris, or developed by Haussmann in Paris in the 19th century, where, of course, we know today, if you know Paris, you know if you're one of the axes, you know where you are because of the Arc de Triomphe, or the Bastille, or Nation, or République, you know, they all have different figures, and you can see from far where you are and situate yourself and understand the global structure. Do you want to translate in 2 minutes, or do you think it's understandable? Is it understandable? Yes? Okay, so let's go on. That's fantastic. I wanted to give this introduction because I think it's also important in order to understand what happens with transportation plans later and with the plans today. This is, in my opinion, a fantastic example. It's one of the first plans of the Belgian railways. You know that Belgium was the first country on the continent to make railways. And it's interesting because it's a trajectory between two cities, and of course it gives you the line, and the line stops in certain places. And what do you see? Each of these places is identified by its iconic buildings. Of course, these iconic buildings are chosen by the director of the railway company. Maybe they are not iconic in themselves, but they are part of nation building, because these buildings are represented as important. The cities are identified as with the buildings. So it's something that even today we have to maybe reflect on. Next. Another kind of attitude is this plan made, this French plan. Well, it's made by French engineers, but it's a European plan, as you see, fantastic. Which gives you the representation of the demands of journeys, of trips, that have to be given away to where the railways will be created. Now, this idea of making the thickness of the line corresponding to a number of travelers is exactly what we do in computers today, with trips, programs, and everything. So it's again a sort of symbolic representation, which is very clear in order to understand what is happening. Yes? Let's go to the real plans of metros. It's a plan which has been talked about very much. Harry Beck, this fantastic designer who in 1936 developed the London Underground plan. Everybody talks about it like a miracle. Let's look why it is a miracle. Let's look at the plans of the metros before Harry Beck. This is the London Metro Plan in 1913. And when you see it, you see that what was attempted is to position each of the lines exactly where they are, topographically. And by doing that, illustrate where they are, but get into a chaos. Nobody understands. And in the end, you wonder, is it important to know? Because the line is under the ground anyway, nobody sees it. But to come to this conclusion was a revolution. Next. The next phase, before Harry Beck, is this plan. And what you see here is that the underground, I mean the topographical basis, has already been left. And that we have an indication of the exact topographical position of the lines with all the different stops. But even that is disturbing, because the topographical position of the lines creates a sort of spaghetti, which you have to search your mind to get out, you know, I mean, it's not so clear. So what Harry Beck did is to bring order to the spaghetti. And when you look at it very clearly, you see that the only relevant element in order to know where we are in London is the river. But it's not true. It's not the only way. It is also the density of the lines. And of course, we get very good indications of where the lines meet each other, where you can transfer from one to the other. But we obviously know that we are in the center of the town here and in the outskirts over there. So the graphic design is in itself a way of representing, even if it's especially made in order to make a sort of a calculation. Because when we speak about wayfinding, we have another way of wayfinding. Here we just count the number of stops and then we know where we are. Now, next. this system, which was invented in the 30s in London, you can say it's being used everywhere in the world for the moment. You know, this is a map of the French RER system, where I don't want to go into the detail, but you see it's a similar graphic situation. This is the Toronto city map, the transit map for public transport, again, similar situations. So there we have a system which is somehow related, not to the graphical underground, but creating a figure in itself which becomes understandable. Next. And this is actually, I think, also what happens today when we have sketches, plans, should I say, maps of larger areas. In this case, for instance, this is the Parisian region. Okay. So what do we see? We see the two airports. We see actually Marne-la-Vallée. We see how the lines of the main high-speed trains go, where they connect, and also sort of the main motorways. So it's a sort of a globe in the rivers. It's a sort of a global structure which renders the whole idea of the agglomeration without going into detail, but allowing you to understand, restricting the information to the bare essential and creating a hierarchy in the information. It's something that today came about in the discussion very clearly. We see it, that it is already happening in this. Next. So, I want to confront what we just saw with these two maps. Barcelona on the left, Toronto on the right. Two cities that are extremely easy to understand when you look at them from the air, especially because of the ensanche and of the large grid structure which exists in Toronto because of the natural ravines. Now, even that in cities that are relatively easy in their structure, we tend to be a little baffled, to be saying, okay, maybe if we are in this part, we can still find our way. What if we come from there and we have to go there? Maybe it's not so easy. So, this is the problem, of course, of the legible city. Our cities have become so vast that we have not been able to develop a sort of system of structure which in our mind makes it possible to know where we have to go. Yes. Next. So let's go back to people who have confronted this idea in theory and see how they approached it. One of these schemes, and I start with this picture because it gives the larger Boston area. For those who know Boston, the Logan Airport, the Boston Bay, the downtown, and so forth, the Charles River that goes to Cambridge, etc. Now, this is actually, this map comes from a very famous book, which I think is still one of the basic books in this respect, by Kevin Lynch, next one please, where we, together with Donald Appleyard and John Mayer, Lynch was in MIT at the time, he was commanded a study in order to say, you know, what should be done with the new motorway they were going to create in the early 60s in Boston. Next. And instead of just beautifying the position, because the original suggestion was the Amarillo, the yellow line, and he suggested a new course, the black line. And the foundation of this new course had to do with how can what we see when we look at the book is an attempt to not just map, like we are used to reading maps, but to understand the structure. You know, what is the importance of the river? You know, where is the center? We immediately see where the center is. What are elements that are influencing, coming into, you know, the center and so forth. And on the right, the first sketches drawn from strategic viewpoints. Yes. And what was attempted, and it's quite intriguing to see that we are talking about 1961, is that with the group, the whole trajectory which was suggested was, we would say, was photoshopped. You know, today we would do it, of course, with the computer. This was drawn with the hand, and it had to do with the view that the driver would have in the two cases. And this has to convince the city of Boston that they should choose for one alternative rather than the other. Next. But on the way, and this is where Lynch was, of course, a university professor, on the way, he developed the whole system. He developed a system of analysis, which was based on observation, as you see to the right, but which had to do with sequences, with, next one, please, orientation, with the places that are thresholds, you know, where you go from one transition to the other, with viewpoints that are crucial. And there was a whole sort of technicality developed as to, you know, not only applying it to the Boston case, but in general to an analysis of cityscapes. Yes. And so, if we go back to this, we see that this book is already the beginning of one of the most famous books that Kevin Lynch did, next please, which is, of course, the image of the city. We will come back to it, in which he develops a method of trying to construct what he calls the mental image of the city. And I begin with these four images, because I cannot stress enough that this mental image was not constructed just by the designer or by the professor. It was four images, depending on how you operate. One image was the one that he and his group thought that was the image of Boston. But besides that, they did interviews with people. They followed 30 people at the time. And these 30 people were verbally asked to explain their trips, what they thought was important, why they thought that they wanted to go rather this way than that way. And out of these interviews, they constructed this image. But these people were also asked to draw their cities from the assumption that what people say and the way they think is not always the same when they draw it. And so when they draw it, they forget to note certain things they may mention when they talk. And so you get four different images, and this is the touristical element. You know, what is the important element officially before any investigation. And so the map of Boston is not one mental map, it's four mental maps. And in respect to some of the things we discussed today in the subgroups, we should be very careful also that we don't think that we can only, us as specialists, think what is the image of the city. We have to construct an image for users. And so we have to somehow confront it with what users really think. Next. So, this book, which was, I don't know, translated in 25 languages, I'm sure it exists in Spanish and also in Portuguese. So, let's pass it. The great advantage of this book is not only that Lynch is extremely clear about a sort of system. He works with 5 terminologies, you know, parts, paths, you know, the path, the edge, the cut, the district, which is one unit, the node, which is where things come together, and the landmarks, which are, let's say, things that people remember. And these 5 constituents, they are, next please, not only very well explained, but the way this book is shaped is also with the concern of making clear to the reader what is really meant, you know. It is not just a book of theory, it's a book where each idea is exemplified by small little drawings, which make it also very evident. Yes? But the interesting thing about the book is that it is not only saying these are the 5 categories, path, edge, node, district, landmark, but depending on who we are interviewing, these elements can be more or less important. And so we see the same elements constructed, but on thicker or thinner lines depending on the interviews. Next. And so this is what I like in a way. It's very scientific. It is not just putting forward things, it is measuring things and giving importance depending on what the interviews are really about. Next. And so, it's not only Boston, it's also Jersey City and Los Angeles who are treated in this book. And what we see is that exactly the same attitude is taken towards the 3 cities. I pass on Jersey, but this is the image of Los Angeles, and you see again, you know, that the path, depending on the response, are stronger or not. And yes, next. That we have again 4 images constructed of mental images of Los Angeles. Now, I don't go into those. The only thing I want to remark is for those who know Los Angeles, that basically, and there again, we are at the great problem, that we are only talking about the central part of the city. Because, you know, this is what Lynch represents. You give me the next one, please. This is what Los Angeles is today. And of course, I didn't do the exercise because I found this image just in my hotel on the internet. But if you would measure what Lynch has been doing on the real map of Los Angeles, it would be a very, very tiny part, you know. And so, there we are really confronted with the problem of scale. And yes, next. The problem which we are addressing today. Okay, quickly. I want to stress, however, that Kevin Lynch is not just a hero. That he is an emanation of a time and of a generation of thought. This fantastic collage called The Street is a collage which represents the man, human being, not man, male, in relation to the public realm. It comes from, next one please, from the book that Chandra Woods, who worked with Candelis, as you know, on Toulouse-Lumirail, for instance, and Chandra Woods made this book in the early 70s, and he addresses this kind of same attitude. I put it next to a book of Jan Gehl, which I read in Flemish translation because it's in Danish and I don't read Danish, but it's translated in every language. Of course, we have Gordon Cullen, of course we have Sigmund Holinach, we have many others that are expressing this attitude of what